Hey guys, so I want to start off by thanking you for entering your email address and showing an interest in this video. I really appreciate it and I hope that you find it useful in some way. Don't forget, you can download some drum samples from this session completely free. All you've got to do is click the link below in the video description for your instant download. Also, remember to drop a comment below the video, get in touch with me via the Facebook page or via the Facebook group. Let me know how you found the video, how you found the drum samples, and hit me up with any questions that you've got. I'll be more than happy to hear them and answer them as best I can. Now, before I start the tutorial, I just want to make it really clear that a great drum sound has to start at the source, with a great player playing a great sounding kit in a great sounding room. If you don't have these things, then there's plenty of virtual drums available that sound awesome, and you can still apply these same techniques and processing moves to those tracks as well. It's also worth remembering that any settings that I show you are for you to use as a starting point. Every kit, every room, every song is different and is going to need different EQ and compression treatment. But you can still use these tips as a starting point. Hopefully they'll get you within the ballpark, and then you can use your ears to adjust and tweak from there. So let's make a start. I'll play you a section of this song that's the drums are completely mixed. The rest of the track is roughly mixed just about, and you can get an idea of what the drums sound like in context of the song. And then I'm going to go through some of the key processing moves that I've used to get the drums to where they are. So let's have a listen.
And I can see it from the look in your eyes that my future's with you. Now I realize that I won't give up, 'cause baby now my heart is yours. Oh, if this is love, I'm never gonna give you up. I'm head over heels, darling, this feels so surreal. To think that I found the one, she's beautiful and stronger than anyone that I know. If you be my girl, and I'll be your man, we'll change the world, and that's the plan.
Okay, so the drums sound really big, they sound really well balanced, and they give an overall polish to the sound. Now, one of the first things that I did in the production stage was I added a few samples. So this was a live recorded kit, but I have used a couple of samples. Now, this wasn't to replace any parts, but to augment them and to add a little bit of what was missing from the spot mics. Now, the samples that I've used, I've got a couple of kick samples. So there's just a kick pearl sample there, and there's also a kick room sample, so like an ambient kick, and then the snare samples that I've used, there's just a one-shot snare sample there, and again a snare room sample, so a more ambient snare sound. Other than that, these are all live drum takes. Now, let's start with the overheads and the rooms. Okay, now some people will go to the overheads and they'll be like, okay, so these are my cymbal mics. And the first thing that they'll do, or one of the first things they might do, is stick a high pass filter on and high pass all the low end off. That's not what I do. About 70 to 80% of my overall drum sound is going to be coming from the overheads and the room tracks. Now, I want the overheads to give an overall image of the drums. I want to hear the full kit. I want to hear everything, the kick, the snare, the toms. So let's have a listen to what the overheads sounded like completely raw. So I'm going to solo the overheads. I'm going to mute any of the buses that I've got active. And let's have a listen to what these sound like. So it sounds okay, but it definitely needs some help. So let's have a look at what processing we've got on the overheads. Now, most of the plugins that I'm using in just about all of my sessions are the Slate plugins, the Slate Everything bundle. It's amazing value for money, and the sound incredible. The sound absolutely astonishing. So that's kind of what I'm using here. But ultimately, most of these plugins are just EQ or compressors. So you can try these things with any other plugins that you have available. Now, the first thing I've got on the chain is this virtual channel. Okay, that individually on the individual tracks, it doesn't do an awful lot. It adds a little bit of saturation and some harmonics, but this is the kind of thing that builds and adds up the more tracks that you put it on. So that's the first thing in my chain. The second thing that I've got is this EQ here. This is basically just a high shelf and a low shelf, and as you can see, I've added quite a chunk of both. So I've got about 6 dB of high shelf, and I've got a lot, 8 dB of lows. I'm then going into another EQ. This is a Neve 1073 style EQ, and I'm adding a little bit of air right on the top. I'm adding, again, a tiny little bit, just 2 or 3 dB of mids. That's around 4.8K. And you'll notice here that I'm adding a big chunk of lows. 60 hertz, 8 decibels. Okay. Now, what that's going to do is it's going to bring the kick drum out. Okay, I told you I wanted the overheads to give an overall image of the kit. I don't want to high pass all that low end out. I want to hear it. The problem I've got with boosting this much low end is that it could introduce a lot of rumble. So I've counteracted that by using the high pass filter set at 50. Okay, so basically between these two bands here, I've created a resonant high pass filter. So filtering up to 50, but then a big boost at 60. With those in, let's now take a listen to what the overheads sound like. That sounds much better. So as you can hear, the top end has become really crispy and really detailed. The transients are really poking out. That hi-hat, that ride cymbal, and the snare are really poking out. They've got a lot of energy to them, and the bottom end is really tight and really controlled. So there's plenty of low end there, but it's not loose and it's not getting too unruly because of that that trick that I've showed you here. Now, one thing you might notice on the overheads is that I've got no compression. Why no compression? Well, if I do that, then all I'm going to get is I'm going to bring the cymbals out, and I'm going to lose transients. I'm going to lack the initial attack of the cymbals and the transients of the snare and the kick, and I'm just going to bring out all of the sustain. I want the transients to poke out. I want to keep the kick and the snare attack intact, and I want to hear the initial crash of the cymbals. So for that reason, no compression. Okay, so now we move on to the rooms. Similar story with the rooms. I want to hear an overall image of the kit, basically what it sounded like in the room. Now, bypass the plugins that I've got. Let's listen to the raw room tracks on their own. Okay, so again, it's okay, but again, it just needs a little bit of help. It's a bit mushy. It needs a little bit of processing to get it to where I want it. So, again, I've got the virtual channel. Let's just add in a very slight amount of saturation. And then I've also got this EQ again, so the high and the low shelf. I'm adding, again, a good chunk of high, about 6 dB. and I'm adding a lot of lows. Okay, so the big lows, that's set nearly all the way to the top, 9 decibels. Okay, so I'm basically creating like a smiley face EQ curve, boosting the lows, boosting the highs. I've then got this compressor, which is a VCA style compressor. Not doing an awful lot, to be honest with you. It's set to a 2-to-1 ratio. The attack is quite fast, and the release is somewhere in the middle. But I'm not taking an awful lot of volume off with the compressor. When I play the track, you'll be able to see where the needle is hitting. Okay, so now let's have a listen to the room mics with these plugins engaged. Again, that is much better. We're getting so much fat bottom end from those room mics, from that low boost. But again, it's not being too unruly. The compressor, as you could see, it was only taking about 3 to 5 dB of gain off it, but all it was doing was just softening the transients just a little bit, and it was help just to bring the ambience out in the mics, just to help that room tone really get out, just to bring it out. So now let's have a listen to the overheads and the rooms together with the processing on. Nice. As you can hear, the overall sound of the kit is pretty much there. We've got a really nice, well-balanced overall image of the whole drum kit. So now what we can focus on is using the spot mics, the close mics, to take it to the next level, okay, and add anything that's missing. So let's move on to the kick drum. So there's quite a few channels of kick drum here. I'll go through them one by one. The first one we've got is the kick in mic. Now this was it was inside of the kick drum, aimed at the beater. And I wanted to get a really clicky attack from this mic. That was the aim of it. Now if I play this without any processing, let's take a listen to what it sounds like. Okay, so again, it's not bad. It's a little bit papery, a little bit boxy. We can certainly take that a few steps further. So let's have a look at the processing that we've got. Again, really keen on this this plugin here. It's just so simple and so effective. It is literally just a high and a low shelf, high lift, low lift. The first thing I've done is I'm adding all the highs, all the way, 10 decibels present. I really want to bring that beater out. I want to bring the click, the attack from the beater. The reason I'm doing that, this is a very thick, a very dense pop rock mix. There's not going to be a lot of room for big low ends on the kick. We are going to get some of that, but if we want to hear the kick drum, particularly on small speakers like your Bluetooth speakers or your iPhone speaker or things like that, we need some top end. So we really need to bring that beater, that attack out, and then we can blend it into taste. I am adding some lows, about 3 to 4 dB. I'm then going into another EQ. This is an SSL style EQ, and as you can see, I'm adding a bunch more of top. 7K, 7.5K, I'm adding 10 decibels. Huge amount of top end coming from this this kick mic. I'm then using a compressor here. The main reason I'm using that is just to keep the level in check. So obviously it's a real drummer in a playing a real kit in a room. Some of the kicks are going to be slightly louder than the others. To be fair, the drummer did a really good job, and the level is extremely consistent. But that compressor is just going to help balance any of those volume issues out. So with those things engaged, let's listen to what that kick now sounds like. Okay, so very, very trebly. Loads and loads of top end. You might be sat there thinking, man, that's just way too much. But what I would emphasize you to do, guys, is listen to these in the context of the entire song. I know I am going through them now in solo. That's to show you the processing moves that I'm doing. But no one is ever going to hear your kick drum in solo. They're going to hear it in context of the entire song. And if you've got a thick, dense pop rock mix, you're going to need some top end from the kick in order for it to cut through. Okay, so again, I'll play that. Let's have a look at what the compressor's doing. Not an awful lot. So the ratio again's fairly low, 3-1. We've got a slow, medium slow attack because I don't want to get rid of the transient. I want to keep some of that transient intact. A medium release time, and we're only taking about 2 to 3 decibels off. Like I said, the guy, the drummer that recorded this was extremely talented, and his level is extremely consistent to begin with. So that's the only reason for that compressor. We then move on to the kick out mic. So this was just a FET 47 mic on the outer skin of the kick, and the aim for this one was to really capture the body of the kick. Okay, so the in mic is getting a lot of attack, it's getting a lot of top end from the beater and a few sort of sub lows. This one really needs to fill the hole. Okay, so we need to get the body, the tone of the kick drum from this mic. Let's take a listen to what this sounded like on its own. Okay, so yeah, again, it's okay. It's nothing particularly exciting. It's pretty dull. It's pretty boring. So let's see what we can do with it. Okay, so we've got an EQ, SSL EQ. I'm adding some top, not a lot, 2 dB, 2-ish dB at around 5-6K, just to bring that top end just a little bit out. I'm adding a very small amount of lows. 87, 90-ish hertz, about 1.5, 2 dB, just to bring some of those lows out. What I'm then doing, what you'll notice on this band, is I'm taking out a huge amount of mids. Now, I've got this band set to 510 hertz. It's on the tightest Q, so the narrowest bandwidth, and I'm taking out nearly all of it, so about 12 dB. I'm taking out there. Now, the reason for that is that this is a very boxy frequency. It will change for you guys depending on what drum kit you're using, what room you're in, what mic you're using. But if I boost this, let's have a listen to what that sounds like. It's really yucky. It's really boxy, really papery. Don't want any of that. Don't want it. Okay, so we'll get rid of it. Take it out. 12 dB. I'm then going on to, again, this EQ here. So the high lift, the low lift. Just add in some more highs because it just sounds so good. And again, I'm just rounding that off with a VCA style compressor. So again, nothing major going on here. 2-to-1 ratio. Slow medium attack. Fastish release. And the main aim of the compressor again is just to level out some of those kick hits, so it's not doing too much gain reduction. Let's have a listen now to that kick drum with all of this engaged. That's much better. We're getting so much body and more energy from that track than we were before. All that papery sound, that boxiness has just gone. I'll really quickly go through the samples, guys. There's nothing much happening here. Now, when you're choosing samples, you can spend some time in the production phase, go through whatever samples you've got, whatever virtual drum kits you've got, and just spend some time trying some different kicks, some different snares, and deciding what works with your kit, with your song. You might find that you don't need any. For me, this song, I felt like I did, so I put some in. Now, this is just a Pearl sample, and it's basically just augmenting the kick in. Okay, I felt like when I played this in context of the full song, I just wasn't getting enough cut from that kick in mic. So I added the sample, and the processing that I've used on the sample is very similar to what I used on that kick in mic. I'm adding loads of top end on the high shelf. I'm adding a really big chunk of bottom end, so creating kind of like a smiley face curve. I'm adding even more top end on this SSL EQ that comes after it at about 7.5K, and then just rounding it off with a compressor. Okay, 3-to-1 ratio, very very high threshold. It's not taking many decibels off at all. Medium slow attack, medium-ish release. So let's have a listen to the kick sample. Again, you might be sat there thinking that sounds way too toppy, way too much high end on it. But again, I really urge you to listen to your tracks in context of the overall mix. That is how much top end it needed to cut through. Moving on to the next sample, so the Room. Now, this is what this sample sounded like on its own, so just a completely dry sample. Now, I've purposely chosen a sample with a lot of ambience. And the reason is because I want this to make the kick drum sound really big. Okay, I want to get some room sound in there, and I want this to give the size to the kick drum. So let's have a listen to what this sounds like on its own. Okay, so yeah, it's okay. We've got some room, some ambience there, but it still needs some help. We need to take it to the next level. So the processing I've got on this, again, I've got the virtual channel. I'm then going into an SSL style EQ. Now, the first thing you'll notice is I'm adding a whole boatload of top end. So 5K, I'm going all the way. 15 dB. I really want to bring that top end, that room sound, that richness from this sample. I'm then adding a big chunk of 1K. So this band here is set to 1K. I'm adding 8 dB. I'm then adding a touch of bottom, so 50 Hertz, about 4.5 dB, just to bring some of that bottom end out. I'm then going into the custom lift, just adding a touch of the bottom of the low shelf, just because it sounds so good. I'm not touching the high shelf on this plugin. So let's now have a listen to what this sample sounds like with these with these plugins engaged. So much energy. The room sound that we're getting from these boosts is just insane. It's just gone from sort of like sounding a little bit ambient to sounding full of energy. I've just play that again without these plugins on. And back on. That now sounds like a kick drum in a room. Sounds great. Sounds awesome. The final thing, folks, I forgot to mention this one. We've got a sub kick down here. Now, this is also a sample. I felt like the kick sound overall was just lacking a touch in real sub lows. Normally, I would record a sub mic on the drum kit. The studio that I recorded this kit at didn't have a sub mic available, so the only option I had was to add this sample in afterwards. Now, again, this isn't mixed particularly high in the track. It's fairly low, it's fairly subtle. It's just adding a little bit of weight to the overall kick sound. Listening on your small speakers, you're never ever going to really benefit from this, but for the people that are listening on great speakers, I can certainly hear it on my monitors here. It just adds a bit more bigness and a bit more overall size to the kit. Now, the processing that I'm doing on the sub kick isn't that much. I'm filtering off everything sort of below 20. There's no useful information down there below 20 anyway. I'm adding a little bit of 50 hertz. It's about 4 to 5 dB of 50 hertz just to bring out those sub lows a little bit more. And then I'm adding just a touch of 1K. Sub mics really tend to be lacking in transients, so just by adding that little bit of 1K, it just gives the sub sample just a bit more poke, just to instead of it just sounding really sort of round, it just helps it sort of poke through a little bit more. Let's have a listen to the sub mic. Okay, so again, it's just adding some lows, and there is a little bit from that 1K, but that's just going to sit underneath the rest of the kicks. Now, let's have a listen to all of those kicks together now. That's a great kick sound. We've really got so much energy and so much balance from all of those kicks together. So we've got the top end, the attack from the kick in and the kick pearl sample. We've got the body from the kick out sample, and then we've got the overall size and some of that ambience from the room kick. Really happy with that. So let's move on to the snare. So again, the snare is spread out across several channels. On this session, I had two top snare microphones. I had a SM57, just to show standard snare mic. I then had that taped to a Beyerdynamic M160 ribbon. I found like both of these microphones really complemented each other. The 57 is very sort of present. It's got a very tight sound and it brings out the crack of the snare. It does lack some weight though, so that's why I teamed it up with the M160. The M160 doesn't have an awful lot of presence, but it really adds an immense amount of weight down below for the snare sound. The transient is a lot softer because with it being a ribbon mic, but the 57 picks up tons of transient, so they really complement each other really well. So let's start with the 57 mic on the top snare. I'll disable the processing. We'll listen to the raw track. Boy, we've got some work to do on that. Sounds really nothing like a snare. It's boring. So let's have a look. What can we do? So I'm back here again with the custom lift EQ, high shelf, low shelf. I'm adding a lot of top end, 8 dB of top. I'm adding all of the lows, really lacking in bottom end that track. So I'm adding all of the low, 10 dB. I'm then going into my SSL style EQ. I'm adding even more top, 11 decibels at 5 to 6K. I'm adding even more lows, that was set to about 140, 150 hertz, and I'm adding 8 dB, 8 to 9 dB. The compressor is then on a 4:1 ratio. It's on a slow attack. That's so that we don't completely destroy the transient. We want the snare to poke out. And the release is set to a medium fast release. I want the compressor to get out of the way between each snare hit. So the release is just set to a time that allows that. Now let's have a listen to what that snare sounds like with that processing engaged. Much better. It's still not there. We're still going to need more elements to our snare sound, but we're getting much closer, and that track is now going to add something to the overall sound. As you can see, the compressor really isn't doing much. We're only taking 2 to 3 decibels of gain reduction off. We don't want to squash it too much. We want to keep the transient intact. We want the snare to poke out. Again, the drummer was very consistent with his snare hits, but this is just keeping any very minor level differences in check. That's the main aim of the compressor. Also, if I overcompress, all I'm going to do really is bring the bleed out from the mic, so we're just going to get too much hat bleed and things like that. So we want to keep the compression fairly light. Move on to the other snare mic. So this was the Beyerdynamic M160. Let's have a listen to what this sounded like without any processing. So as you can hear immediately, it's a completely different sound to the 57. We've got way more bottom end. In fact, it could be considered to be virgin on muddy. And there is less transient. There's less poke from this track. So the processing we've gone for, overall, it's very, very similar. We want to bring some of that top end out, and we want to enhance that low end. Okay, by doing both of those things, not only do we make it sound more crisp with the top and more beefy with the lows, we've also essentially created a smiley face to duck out those boxy mids and those muddy mid-range frequencies that just sounded a bit nasty. We're then going into the SSL EQ. We're adding some more top, about 5 to 6k, and we're adding about 8 decibels, and then we're adding even more lows. Again, 150 hertz. That's where this snare sounds really nice, and we're boosting a lot of that, about 9 decibels. The compressor, again, it's very similar setting, 4:1 ratio, slow attack, not much transient on this channel, but we want to keep what bit there is. The release is set so that it gets out of the way between each snare hit. Let's have a listen to the to this microphone now. That's a really nice sounding snare on that. I'm loving the thickness and the weight that I'm getting from this microphone. That's really where I find the 57s lack, but the 57s have so much great top end and presence that really helps the snare crack and poke through. But teamed with the M160, I'm really happy with how that combination has worked. We then move on to the snare bottom mic. Okay, so this was just a 57 on the underside of the snare. Let's have a listen to what this sounded like on its own. Okay, so this track's basically just going to reinforce the crack and the rattle from the snare. Okay, we might not need a lot of it but it's there, and we can adjust it to taste. Now, something that I see a lot of people doing, particularly bands that are self-producing, is they'll go to the snare bottom mic, and the first thing they'll do is grab a high-pass filter and filter out all of the lows. Well, let's have a look at what I've done. I've got my SSL style EQ, and I'm actually boosting some lows. I found this frequency here, 240 Hz, and I'm boosting 8 decibels. I'm doing not a lot to the mid-range, nothing in fact, but then at 5K, I've got a high shelf set to about 6 decibels. So why have I added this low boost down here? Well, let's have a listen to what this snare sounds like with this processing engaged. Not only am I getting some great crack from the snare, but there's some kick drum in there. If I filter out all the bottom end, I'm going to lose that kick drum. Why would I want to do that? There's useful information there. That kick actually sounds pretty good. It sounds pretty punchy and pretty aggressive. So let's use it. Let's not waste it. So that is what this low boost is doing down here. Again, if I turn this off, listen to the raw track. Put these plugins back in. We can certainly use that kick drum. That sounds great. The final thing I've got is a compressor. This is an 1176 style compressor. It's a very fast action. It kind of goes from fast to faster on the attack. And then the release I've got set to the fastest setting. And again, this is just keeping the level in check. I'm not compressing too much. So just somewhere between 1 and 3 decibels. Again, just keeping the level in check. Moving on to the snare samples then. So this track here is just a one-shot snare sample. I went through a few different ones. This is one that I settled on. Let's have a listen to the sample on its own. Okay, that needs something to make it sound more exciting. So let's have a look. What can we do? So, very, very similar treatment to what I've used on the top snare mics. I'm adding a ton of top end. 8 decibels of top. I'm adding all of the lows that I can get from this custom lift. 10 decibels of punchy lows. I'm then going into an SSL EQ. I'm adding even more top end to bring the crack of the snare out. So again, 5 to 6K at around 10 dB. And again, I'm adding even more lows, 150 Hz. This snare sounds great at around 150 Hz. I'm boosting 10 dB almost, all the way down there. And again, I've got my compressor. It's a VCA style compressor, 4:1 ratio, but the threshold is set very high, so it's not going to be taking much off. Slow attack. I want to keep the transient intact. I don't want to squash that. And the release somewhere around the middle so that it gets out of the way between each snare hit. Let's now have a listen to to what this sounds like. Much more exciting. The final one then, folks, is this snare room sample. So like the kick room sample, I wanted something that's got some ambience, quite a lot of ambience, because again, this is going to give some overall size to the snare sound. This is what the sample sounded like completely on its own. Okay, so it's not bad. but we can certainly make it a bit more exciting. So the first thing I've got is an EQ, SSL style EQ. 6K, I'm adding a whole chunk of that, so about 8 decibels at 6K. I'm adding some more lows, again around 150, 160 160 hertz, about 8 dB. I've then got my compressor. Now, we've got this set to 4:1 ratio. I've got the threshold very low. The attack is kind of medium slow, keep some of the transient intact, and the release is pretty fast, again, to get out of the way in time. Now, this is going to trigger a huge amount of gain reduction, but what I've got here, the mix setting down here, is all the way down to 20%. So this is kind of creating a parallel compression setting, okay? If this was to 100%, it would be way too compressed, way too much. But the great thing about overcompression is that it can give a lot of energy. So if I dial that mix setting back, I'm basically blending in the very overcompressed sound with the uncompressed sound, and I can blend that into taste. So let's have a listen to what this sounds like now with this engaged. That's going to add some really big size to the snare. We've got some great room tone, we've got some great body, and we've got some great smack from the snare. Now, just so that you can hear what's happening, if I take the mix setting all the way up to 100%, have a listen to this now. That's just way too much. Sure, it's got lots of energy and lots of impact, but overall it's just too much. So if we dial that back, we're just blending in 20% of that very overcompressed sound with the uncompressed sound, and now we've got the best of both worlds. So now let's have a listen to our overall snare sound. So all of these tracks, all playing together. Let's hear it. That sounds great. Really, really happy with that. We've got lots of energy. We've got some nice presence, so the snare's going to cut through. We've got the transients there, so it's going to poke through the dense mix, and it's also got some weight. It's not going to sound weak, it's not going to sound wimpy. It's got some authority in that snare sound. Okay, moving on to the next part then. So I've got a hi-hat track here. Now, the hi-hat I've got panned all the way to the left. I like to mix drums from drummer's perspective. It's entirely up to you if you mix it from drummer's or audience perspective. It doesn't really matter. It's personal taste. Now, the first thing with the hi-hat track, while I will always record one, if I'm recording a live kit, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm always going to use it in the mix. The hi-hat is going to bleed through everything. You're going to get plenty of hi-hat in the overheads and the room mics. So you might find, and I have done this on several occasions, where you just don't need it. Just mute it. If you've got too much hi-hat, consider muting the individual spot mic on the hi-hat. For this track, I didn't feel like I had too much hi-hat in the overheads or the rooms, so I am using this. It is mixed pretty low relative to the rest of the kit, but it's still there. Okay, so let's have a listen to what the hi-hat sounded like on its own. Pretty dull, pretty uninspiring. So let's have a look what we can do. So again, pulling up the Slate Virtual Mix Rack. I just want to say at this point, folks, I am in absolutely no way affiliated to Slate at all. I just love their plugins, and the value from the Everything bundle is just insane. Okay, they just sound awesome. I can work really quickly with them. But like I said, if you don't have the Slate Everything bundle, just about everything what I've done so far is just EQ compression. You can use whatever EQs compressors you have available. Now, on the hi-hat then, I've got the SSL style EQ, and again, what a lot of people will do is they'll reach for the low cut and take that all the way up to 3, 4, 500 hertz. We'll get rid of all that low end. Well, again, I haven't. I've got this set to around 25, 30 hertz. Well, why have I done that? Let's listen to the hi-hat track. Let's actually listen to what we've got in there. Again, as well as the hi-hat, I can hear some kick drum. It's a very similar story to that bottom snare mic. Why would I want to lose that? I don't. I want to utilize it. I want to use everything that I've got. So instead of filtering out all the lows, I'm not. I'm actually boosting them. So at 50, 52 hertz, I'm adding about 6 to 7 dB of EQ. That's going to bring the kick out. It's going to sound awesome. It's going to sound punchy. It's going to sound great. On the top band, on the top shelf, I'm adding a little bit of like 11, 12K just to bring some sparkle out from the hi-hats. And then taking away just a very small amount of 1K. Okay, 1K can get a little bit gritty. I felt like these hats were very aggressive in that sort of range. So I'm just taking just a touch out, just 2 dB. The final plugin I've got is this one called Revival. This is basically an exciter. It adds low harmonics and high harmonics, and it literally does what it says on the tin. Okay, so if I put that setting up, it's going to add some shimmer. Okay, it's going to add some high harmonics, and it's just going to make the hi-hat more sparkly, but without actually boosting the high frequencies. It's just going to add some harmonics. I don't need any low harmonics from the hi-hat, so that's all the way down. But that's just adding a little bit more sparkle. Let's listen to what the hi-hat sounds like with the EQ and this exciter engaged. That sounds great. So again, it might not even be necessary in your production to have an individual hat mic. You might find that you mute it, but if not, it can be quite useful, and you can blend that in to taste with the overall kit. Moving on to the toms. Now, before I show you the processing, something I want you to take notice of is the first thing I've done on these tom tracks is I've cut out everything in between the tom hits. I've got rid of all of the bleed. Okay. Now, the reason that I've done that is quite simple. When I start processing these toms, if I start adding some top, adding some bottom, there's going to be an insane amount of bleed from the cymbals. And it's just going to sound, it's going to get out of control. So I've silenced it all. I've cut it all out. Now, the downside to doing that is that you are going to lose some body from the toms, okay? You're going to lose some of the ring. However, that's not such a big problem because the body of the toms is coming out through the overheads and the rooms. Remember, we use the overheads and the rooms to get an overall image of the kit. So there's going to be plenty of ring, plenty of tone and body coming through them from the toms. So all we really need from these close mic toms is just the initial attack. Okay, so it is going to sound a bit cut off, but that's fine because remember we're going to be blending this in with the overhead and the room tracks. So let's have a listen to what the toms sounded like just on the raw recording. that's not too bad. So there's quite a nice sound from those toms. They're quite meaty. They've got some nice top end, some nice energy. Let's have a listen to some of these fills where the toms were playing within the whole kit. So as you can see, it sounds pretty unnatural, but we don't have to worry about that, because like I said, the body, the ring, the tone will come through the overheads and the rooms. Okay, we literally just need this for that initial transient, that initial attack. Now, I will say, folks, I have added a tom sample, so it's just a tom room, an ambient tom sample. However, I'm only using that in one specific section of the song. This particular song starts with the drums just on the floor tom, and I felt like I wanted a little bit of a bigger sound from the toms, so I have added a sample. The rest of the song, I don't have any tom samples at all. I'm getting enough of what I need from the original recording. Okay, so the tom sample is just for this intro bit. If it wasn't for the intro bit, I wouldn't have needed it. So let's have a look at the processing. Very simple, not too much going on here. So I'm adding some top. I've got about 7 dB at 5k. That's going to bring out the transient. It's going to make the tom poke out of the mix. I'm adding some lows, about 50, 60 hertz at 5 to 6 dB. That's going to bring out the roundness of the tom. I'm then cutting out a whole bunch of mids. Okay, so again, we're around 500 hertz, very similar to the kick out mic. This is a very boxy frequency. It's very boxy, it's very papery. So on the tightest bandwidth, I'm taking it all out. Let's have a listen to what the toms sound like with that EQ engaged. Much better. They're much cleaner, much crisper. Let's have a listen to just this fill over here. Again, the poke, the transient, the attack is there, and that's really what we're after. The tom room sample, it's pretty. I'll quickly show you. It's pretty much the same EQ setting, and that is just adding just a bit more weight to this section at the beginning where the drums are all on the toms. Okay, and there we pretty much have all our individual processing. So now let's put all of that together and let's see what we have. Again, I just want to make sure that the buses are muted, because that's what I'm going to move on to next. Let's take a listen to that drum sound now. We've come quite a way. So we are almost there now. Really, really happy with that drum sound. We've taken it from weak, wimpy, just an uninspiring, a bit muddy, to really upfront and really crisp and really clear. However, there is still more that we can do. Okay, this is a big pop rock song. We want the drums to come out of the speakers. We don't want them to stay back. We want them to feel like the drums are jumping out of the speakers and they are right in front of us. So that leads me on to the next stage of the processing, which is all on some buses. Okay, guys, so the next part of the drum tutorial, the processing, is really what's going to finish off the drum sound. We've got we've got a great drum sound as it is, but we really want it to now pop out of the speakers. We want it to go from being sort of flat and in the speakers, contained, to really jumping out and grabbing the listener's attention. Okay, now that's going to be done on a couple of these buses down here. Okay, now the first thing I've got is all of my drum tracks, every single one of them, going to this auxiliary track here, drum parallel track. Okay, now this is then blended into taste with the rest of the kit. It's pretty over-processed, it's very over-compressed, it's very bright, but if you mix this in with the rest of your kit, then it really helps your drums pop. Now in the verses, you might want to dial this parallel drum track all the way back, or even turn it off, even mute it, and then just bring it in for the choruses to make your drums explode in the choruses. Okay, for me, I've got it set all the way down until the second chorus hits. There's no drums anyway until the second verse. In that part of the song, the parallel track is very, very low, but then I've got it coming all the way up, or pretty high up, when that second chorus hits. Okay, from then on in this song, it's pretty full on. So the parallel track is just stays where it is. I don't need to blend it in or out, or do anything much to it. But you might find that you have to. Okay, the second part of the bus processing is this reverb. Okay, this is just a room reverb, and I'm not sending all of the tracks to it. Now, what you'll notice is that I'm sending just the room mics and the stereo snare sample. So that snare room, the ambient snare sample, those are the only two things that are going to my reverb. Okay. Now the reason is, I don't want to send the full kit because that will just be overkill. I just want to augment the room sound a little bit more. The room mics sound good, but I just want to get a little bit more from them. Okay, and the snare, well, that's a huge part of this song. So I am also blending in the snare room sample as well to this reverb. Now, if we have a look at the reverb that I've actually chosen, it's a short reverb. It's a medium room. Pretty fast decay, about 600, 700 millisecond decay. And that, again, is another thing that I see a lot of guys doing, is they'll get a drum reverb and they will choose a huge hall. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. If you've got a sparse production, that could be just the reverb that your drum sound needs. However, in a very dense, a very thick, a very populated production, generally there's just not enough room for that much reverb. You're just not going to hear it. And so what people then tend to do is boost the reverb track and make it really, really high in the mix, and it just sounds unnatural. It sounds mushy and undefined. So let's choose a shorter reverb. We don't need a massive decay. We don't need a 1 second, 2 second decay. That's just too much. You're not going to hear it. Short decay. Let's make it short and snappy. Now, before we go into the reverb, I've actually got an EQ. Okay, so this EQ is on the aux track before it hits the reverb. What I'm doing is taking a little bit of lows out. So 240 hertz, I'm taking just a very small amount out, 3 decibels. And then I'm adding a whole chunk of 1K. Okay, so this is a high shelf, and it is set to 1.5K. And it's boosting everything above that frequency. And as you can see, I've not been shy about how much I wanted to add. 11 dB. Okay, now let's have a listen to what that actually does. If we solo this track, let's take a listen. So as you can hear, it's really, really short. Okay, there's no huge room sound, no huge long decay, just a very short, very snappy reverb. Now if I take that EQ out, so this EQ, I've now disabled that. Listen to what the reverb sounded like on its own. Skip to the chorus where it's mixed a bit higher. And we put the EQ back in. It's just helping to reinforce that crack, particularly from the snare, and it's just adding some nice crispness that I felt was missing in the original Rooms. I'll now play the overall drum sound with the reverb in. Again, I'm going to mute the parallel tracks. We've not got onto that bit yet. So this is the drums without the reverb. And now with the reverb. As you can hear, it adds a tremendous amount of size and a tremendous amount of impact, but without making the overall drum sound mushy and undefined, which is what you'd likely get from a really long decay time. Okay, so that I'm happy with that. That is adding to the room sound. That's making the drum sound even bigger. Now let's move on to this drum parallel track. This really is going to make the drums pop out of the speakers. Now all of the drum tracks are routed to this through this track. Now the first thing that I've got is this plugin here. This is also from Slate. It's called FG Bomber, and it's kind of like a mixture of EQ and compression all in one box. So it's as you add the drive, as you push more into this, it's bringing out some fatter lows, some more crisp highs, but it's also compressing as well, and it's compressing very, very hard. Now I've got this on the tight setting, so that's going to keep the low end big, but it's not going to make it too flabby. It's going to keep it tight. And it's also going to make the top end, it's going to give it a really nice presence. Okay, now I've got the drive set so that the needle is hitting pretty high up. Okay, with this particular plugin, if you hit 0, which is about where the bomb is, it sounds completely different to if you push past that. Okay, and for this particular sound, I wanted to bring out the transient, but I wanted some sustain from it as well. I wanted to bring out sort of like the tail end of those transients. So I wanted to really squash them down, but then bring out the sustain, bring out the room, and make the drums just sound really fat and really full of energy. I've then followed that with an EQ. I'm just adding a touch of 5K, a 5K bell curve, and again just some more lows, 100-ish, 110-ish hertz, 4.5 dB, and then finally I've got a compressor. This is an SSL bus compressor. The ratio is set to 4:1. I've got the attack on slow to keep some of the transient intact. I don't want to completely get rid of the transients. And then the release is just set to auto. And the threshold is set very low so that I'm triggering a huge amount of gain reduction. I'm going to be hitting around 10 dB of gain reduction. Again, that is going to help with the energy. Now let's have a listen to what this sounds like completely on its own. So this is just the parallel drum track, not the drums that we had before. This is just the parallel track. Okay, so it's way too much. There's way too much top, way too much bottom, and just an insane amount of compression. Okay, that doesn't necessarily sound too good on its own. But again, we're not worried about that. We're worried about what it sounds like in the mix. Now, while it is overcompressed, that energy is going to sound awesome once we start to blend this track in with the rest of the overall kit. Okay, now if I play the drums on their own, so I'm going to mute that parallel drum track. So this is the drums with the processing, with the reverb, but with the parallel track muted. Now let's put the parallel track in and see what and listen to what we've got. That's quite an enormous difference. To me, I can hear a huge difference there. The kick just has so much more impact, so much more energy. The snare is now coming at you. It's coming out of the speakers. Let's just listen again. I'm going to turn this parallel track on and off while it's playing. So watch out for this going on mute and then coming back on, and just really focusing on the difference in energy. Particularly pay attention to the kick and the snare. So we'll start with it on, and then I'll turn it off. I don't know about you guys, but for me, that is the difference between a very good drum sound and a great drum sound. That really finishes it off. So now if we put all of those things together, we listen to it in the context of the full song. Let's see what we've got. So pay attention to the lift that we get when the chorus hits. So that's a combination of the parallel drum track coming in and also the reverb coming in. I have got some automation going off, particularly on the mix bus, so some volume automation. But also listen to the energy, listen to the size that we're getting from the drums, the kick, the snare. Remember the processing that we did on the kick, those mics that just sounded way too toppy, but they're really going to cut through. Let's take a listen.
And I can see it from the look in your eyes that my future's with you. Now I realize that I won't give up, 'cause baby now my heart is yours. Oh, if this is love, I'm never gonna give you up. I'm head over heels,
So what we've got there, guys, that's a really good foundation to then build the rest of the song on. So we can now start looking at the bass guitar, locking the bass guitar in with the drums. We can then look at the guitars and the vocals, and we can really build a fantastic mix on those drums. Those really are the foundation of this track. And like many tracks in the pop, rock and country genre, it often begins with a really strong rhythm section. And a great drum sound is really going to help you get there. So I hope that video has been useful to you guys. I hope that you take something away from it, and I really hope that you can apply some of these processing tips and that it helps you in your own productions. Don't forget, get the download of the drum samples from this session. It's completely free. It's in the video. It's in the description below this video. Click the link and you'll get instant access to that download. Also, get in touch with me by leaving a comment. Get in touch with me on the Facebook group or the Facebook page. Any questions that you've got, I'll be happy to address them and answer them the best I can. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. See you soon.